The film Wicked Little Letters, starring Olivia Coleman, is based on a real-life mystery from the 1920s. Residents in the small town of Littlehampton Sussex were tormented by a batch of, wicked letters. The tale involves some very rude language, someone getting framed and sent to jail for a crime she didn't commit, and an ingenious plan that eventually caught the real culprit. The story began when Rose Gooding and her husband Bill moved to Littlehampton in 1918. They initially got on well with the neighbours, particularly Edith Swan, who lived next door. Edith would share useful household items like recipes and knitting patterns with Rose, and Rose lent Edith a tin bath. This friendly arrangement wasn't to last, as their relationship soon became much less neighbourly. The Goodings complaining about the Swans' rabbits, and the Swans complaining about the Goodings' overflowing bins. Things really escalated after the Goodings had a noisy argument on Easter Sunday of 1920, overheard by Edith and their other neighbour, Mr. William Birkin. According to Edith, Rose was accusing her husband Bill of being the father of her sister Ruth's baby. Mr. Birkin described Rose's language as the filthiest language I had ever heard. Swearing had become more prevalent among men after the First World War, but it was still considered that a respectable woman would never use such language. Edith made a complaint to the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, claiming that Rose was mistreating her sister's newborn baby, but the inspector couldn't find any evidence of mistreatment. Shortly after that is when things really started to get weird. People in the town, especially Edith, began to receive vicious letters, full of expletives and insults still too rude to repeat today. The letters were all signed either R or RG, and one even finished with Mrs. Gooding's compliments. All evidence pointed to Rose, but her and Bill denied she had written the letters. Edith claimed the letters were retaliation for her reporting Rose to the NSPCC, and wanted Rose punished, but there wasn't sufficient grounds for a public prosecution. However, at the time, it was possible, though expensive, to prosecute someone privately. A private prosecution wouldn't have had as thorough an investigation as a public one, which is perhaps the cause of the miscarriage of justice that followed. In September, Rose appeared before the magistrates, and with little evidence available, it came down to Edith's word against hers. Edith came across as a respectable woman, and the local police superintendent described her as bearing a very good character. In regards to Rose, on the other hand, he simply announced that she had had an illegitimate child, as though that was proof enough of her bad character. Unable to afford bail, Rose was put in prison until her trial at Los Assizes, where she was sentenced to a further 14 days behind bars. You might think that would be the end of it, but shortly after Rose returned home, the letters started up again. Edith used this to bring a second private prosecution against Rose, and again, Rose denied sending the letters. But if Rose wasn't sending the letters, then who was? Rose's barrister produced the handwritten knitting instructions and chutney recipe that Edith had given Rose, as the handwriting was strikingly similar to the handwriting in the poison pen letters. Edith simply denied she ever wrote the knitting instructions and chutney recipe, and such was the prejudice against Rose, the judge even declined the jury's requests for samples of the pair's handwriting. Rose was locked up again for 12 months. But at this stage, Edith made an error. Perhaps trying to frame Rose for a further prosecution, she claimed to have found a notebook filled with more obscene writing in the same handwriting as the letters. She sent the notebook into the police with a letter claiming to have found the book on Western Road. The police grew suspicious as the handwriting in the accompanying note looked surprisingly similar to the writing in the obscene notebook, and since Rose was in prison at the time, it seemed unlikely it was written by her. With this new evidence, Rose was released from prison only 3 months into her sentence, and Inspector Nichols of Scotland Yard was put on the case to find the real culprit. Who could it be? Nichols searched the houses and found blotting paper at the Swans, which contained imprints of some of the libelous letters. Edith claimed Rose had borrowed the blotting paper back when they were friends. In an attempt to break this stalemate, a policewoman, Gladys Moss, hid out in a nearby potting shed to observe the houses, and eventually one day witnessed Edith dropping an abusive letter on the floor outside Violet May's back door at number 49. With this newfound evidence, a few months later it was Edith's turn to go on trial like Rose had done previously. But unlike in Rose's case, the judge just could not believe such an upstanding woman as Edith Swan could possibly use such language, and rejected the evidence. Surprisingly, considering this near miss, Edith did not stop sending the letters. For Inspector Nichols, it was obvious that Edith Swan was the writer of the letters. He just needed a way to prove it so undeniably that the prejudices of judges and jurors would not enable her to get away with it. A plan was hatched, and in the summer of 1923, detectives marked some postage stamps with invisible ink, and told the Littlehampton post office that those stamps were only to be sold to Miss Swan. One evening that June, she posted an obscene letter in the postbox, and after observing her post it, police applied chemicals to the stamp to reveal the invisible ink, and finally they had enough evidence to arrest her again. Alarmingly, despite the evidence, the judge still couldn't believe such a respectable woman was capable of writing such nasty letters. But fortunately, the jury saw through Edith and she was sentenced to 12 months behind bars. Despite the initial miscarriage of justice, the truth had finally come to light. If you like unusual stories from the past, like this one, you should take a look at this video about London's Lost Railway for the Dead, or this one about why people used to rent pineapples.